In the summer of 1998, a fungal blight wiped out 96% of the soybean crop in Dawes County, Nebraska. Every commercial hybrid field turned to a blackened ruin within 3 weeks. Every field, except one. And the old farmer everyone had mocked for his stubborn seeds suddenly held the only future the county had left in the palm of his hand. That farmer was Silas Gable. For 30 years, his neighbors called him stubborn, backwards, even foolish for refusing to plant the modern, high-yield seeds that promised prosperity. They watched their profits soar while he saved and replanted the same heirloom varieties his great-grandfather brought west. But as the blight spread, a single question became urgent. Why had Silas Gable, alone, seen the coming storm? The answer begins 40 years earlier with a lesson written in dust and loss. In 1958, Silas Gable was 9 years old. He stood with his grandfather in a field that should have been waist-high with corn by July. It was dust, not dry dirt, but a fine gray powder that puffed around their boots with every step. The entire 40-acre plot was dead. Not a single stalk had survived. That spring, almost every farmer in Dawes County had planted the same new hybrid seed, the Miracle Maize variety promoted by the county extension agent. It promised 30% higher yields. It delivered 100% susceptibility to a new strain of rust that arrived on the wind in May. Silas's grandfather, Elias, walked to the edge of the dead field and knelt. He scooped a handful of the gray dust, let it sift through his fingers, and looked at his grandson. This is what happens when you put all your faith in one basket, boy. When everyone plants the same thing, everyone fails the same way. Elias Gable had not planted the Miracle Maize. He planted a mix of 12 different corn varieties he'd saved for decades: Bloody Butcher, Reed's Yellow Dent, a Dakota Flint corn, others with no commercial names. Only 2 of those 12 varieties showed any rust at all, and it was minor. He harvested enough from those surviving rows to feed his livestock through the winter. His neighbors, who had bet everything on the miracle, had nothing. They had to buy feed at inflated prices, taking loans against next year's crop. Elias didn't say "I told you so." He just took Silas to the barn after supper, opened a wooden chest filled with cloth sacks, each carefully labeled, and said, "This is the real harvest. This is what we keep." Let me tell you about the chest, because that chest and what it represented became the central artifact of Silas Gable's life. It was made of oak, built by Elias' father in 1890. Inside were not just seeds, but stories. Each sack had a year written on it in pencil. Some had notes. Drought year, this bean made it. Cold spring, this squash set fruit. Flood, only this tomato produced. This was the family's living library, a record of resilience written in genetic code. While agricultural science was beginning its relentless march toward uniformity, the Gables were practicing a different kind of science: observation, selection, and saving what worked when everything else didn't. Silas learned to shell beans, winnow wheat, and dry squash seeds not as chores, but as sacred rituals. He learned that a seed wasn't just a thing you bought. It was a story you carried forward. By the time Silas took over the farm in 1974, agriculture had transformed. The Green Revolution was in full swing. Seed companies, Monsanto, Pioneer, Cargill, were selling packages of promise. Hybrid corn, hybrid soybeans, hybrid wheat. These seeds produced incredible uniform yields, but they came with 2 non-negotiable conditions. First, you had to buy them new every year. Saved hybrid seeds either wouldn't grow true or would produce a pathetic, unstable crop. Second, they were designed to be grown with specific chemical fertilizers and pesticides, often sold by the same companies. It was a closed loop, and the farmer was locked inside. The county extension service, once a source of practical advice, now functioned as a sales channel for these products. At annual meetings, representatives would present graphs showing skyrocketing average yields. Anyone not participating was framed as a drag on progress, a holdout from a poorer past. Silas attended those meetings. He sat in the back of the Grange Hall while slick-haired men in suits pointed to charts. He listened as his neighbors, men like Dave Kressler and Bill Jepson, asked about payment plans and bulk discounts. After one meeting in 1976, the regional seed manager for a major company, approached him. "Son, I see you here every year, but I never see an order from you. We've got a new soybean that'll out-yield what you're planting by 40%. "What are you planting anyway?" Silas looked at the man. "I'm planting what my grandfather planted." The man smiled, a condescending, pitying smile. "Well, that's your prerogative, but you're leaving a lot of money in the field. Your neighbors are expanding, buying more land because they can afford to with these yields. You're going to get left behind." That night, Silas wrote in his farm ledger not a financial entry but a note. Left behind from what? A race to a cliff. The pressure wasn't just economic, it was social. Farming is a community, and in Dawes County, that community was shifting its identity. To be a modern farmer was to use modern inputs. The local co-op, where farmers once traded seeds and advice, now had a bright new showroom full of branded seed bags and chemical drums. Silas would come in to buy twine or fuel, and the conversation would die when he approached the counter. The men would be talking yields per acre, herbicide schedules, and then go quiet. They weren't being mean, they were being polite. They didn't want to embarrass him by talking about a world he'd chosen to opt out of. His childhood friend, Dave Kressler, tried to bridge the gap once over coffee at the diner. "Silas, nobody thinks you're a bad farmer. We all know you work hard. But you're working smart for 1950, not for today. You could double your output with half the labor. Why make it hard on yourself?" Silas stirred his coffee. "My grandfather worked hard so I wouldn't have to be afraid, Dave." "Afraid of what?" "Of a bad year, of a new bug, of the company raising the price of the seed or the chemical I can't do without. I'm not working for this year's yield. I'm working for the year when your yield is zero." Dave laughed, a nervous laugh. "That's doom and gloom stuff. Science has that covered. They've got resistances bred in now." Silas didn't argue, he just paid for his coffee and left. The gulf was no longer about practice, it was about philosophy. To the hybrid farmers, risk was managed by chemistry and genetics supplied from outside. To Silas, risk was managed by diversity and knowledge held within. He was alone in his philosophy. By 1985, a survey by the State Agricultural College showed that 94% of Dawes County's row crop acreage was planted with commercial hybrid seeds from one of three major companies. The remaining 6% was almost entirely Silas Gable's 320 acres. Let me tell you about the winter of 1987, because that's when the first real test came, and when Silas's isolation became a tangible, physical burden. An early, vicious ice storm in November took down power lines and froze pipes across the county. It also collapsed the old roof on Silas's seed barn, a separate building where he kept his chest and dozens of glass jars of seed. He woke to the sound of cracking timber and rushed out into the sleet. The central beam had snapped. Part of the roof was in the dirt, and water was dripping onto the shelves holding a century of collected seeds. Silas spent the next 48 hours in a frantic, frozen rescue mission. He moved jars and sacks into his kitchen, onto his porch, into his living room. He laid seeds on screens and towels by the wood stove to dry them out, checking each batch for moisture. He didn't sleep. He didn't eat. He just worked, his hands numb, his breath fogging in the cold house. There was no one to call for help. His neighbors were all busy with their own crises, burst pipes in their heated barns, generators failing for their automated feeders. Their operations were vulnerable in a different way to infrastructure failure. His vulnerability was total, personal, and immediate. If he lost those seeds, he lost everything. Not just a year's income, but his entire reason for farming. At dawn on the third day, with the seeds stabilized and a tarp stretched over the broken roof, Silas sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by sacks of beans and corn, and put his head in his hands. He was 58 years old. He was exhausted, and for the first time, he wondered if his grandfather's faith had been a curse. The phone rang. It was Dave Kressler. "Hey Silas, heard you got some damage. You need a hand. We got our power back. I can bring the generator over." Silas looked at the chaos of his kitchen, at the legacy he was literally living inside. "No, Dave, I'm all right. I've got it under control." "You sure? It's no trouble, I'm sure. Thanks." He hung up. The offer was genuine, but it underscored the divide. Dave's solution was a temporary generator, an external fix. Silas's problem was the survival of a system, and no generator could fix that. He had to fix it himself, seed by seed. That spring, he replanted every variety, not for harvest but for seed multiplication. He needed to rebuild his stocks to ensure that even if a jar was lost, the lineage continued. It took him 3 years of careful, dedicated work to fully restore the collection. 3 years during which his neighbors, planting their pristine, purchased hybrids, asked him why parts of his fields looked so scraggly and mixed. He didn't explain. He just kept planting and saving and waiting. He knew the ice storm was just a weather event. The real test was still coming, and it would not drip from a broken roof. It would ride on the wind. The wind arrived in late June of 1997. It carried a new strain of Phytophthora acai, a water mold that causes soybean root rot. For decades, commercial soybean hybrids had been bred with genetic resistance to older strains. This new strain, designated Race 25, had a different genetic profile. The resistance was useless. The first reports came from the eastern edge of the county. A farmer named Bill Jepson noticed yellowing patches in his field on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday, the patches had merged into a continuous swath of wilted, dying plants. He called the county extension agent, a man named Jim Coyle. Jim drove out, took samples, and sent them to the state diagnostic lab. The confirmation came back 4 days later. It was Race 25. Jim Coyle's first official action was to send a bulletin to every farmer in his mailing list. The subject line read, "Urgent, new soybean blight confirmed." The bulletin recommended a specific fungicide, applied immediately, and warned that the pathogen could spread via soil, water, and wind-borne spores. What the bulletin did not say, because Jim didn't know it yet, was that the recommended fungicide was only about 30% effective against this particular race. The seed companies were still scrambling for data. Let me tell you about the scramble, because when Jim Coyle called the regional agronomist for the dominant seed company in the region, the conversation was not about solutions. It was about liability. Jim asked point blank, which of your varieties show any resistance to Race 25? There was a long pause on the line. The agronomist cleared his throat. Jim, our breeding program is evaluating that now. We don't have field data for this specific race. It's newly identified. So none of them are resistant. I didn't say that. I said we don't have the data. The resistance packages in our top sellers are for races 1 through 18. Jim hung up the phone and stared at the map of Dawes County on his wall. Nearly every soybean field on that map was planted with seeds from that company, or one of its 2 major competitors. They all used similar genetic sources for resistance. They were all effectively the same plant wearing different brand names. A uniform crop facing a novel threat. He remembered a line from a college plant pathology textbook. Genetic uniformity is the precondition for catastrophic loss. He felt sick. In the fields, the collapse was geometric. The blight didn't kill plants one by one. It killed them in expanding circles like ink blots on a map. A plant would wilt, then its neighbors, then a whole row, then a quadrant. The fungicide applications, costly and time-consuming, seemed to slow the spread in some fields but never stopped it. The soil itself became the enemy. The pathogen produced resilient spores that could survive for years. Once a field was infected, replanting soybeans there the next year was a gamble with terrible odds. By the 3rd week of July, the county was a checkerboard of green and dead. Farmers stood at the edges of their fields, watching a lifetime of work dissolve. Dave Kressler, Silas's old friend, had 400 acres in soybeans. He applied the fungicide twice at a cost of $28 an acre. He watched it fail. He called Jim Coyle every other day, his voice tightening with each call. "What do I do now, Jim? What's the next thing? There's always a next thing." Jim had no next thing. The playbook was empty. Now let me tell you about the field that wasn't on Jim Coyle's map. Silas Gable's 320 acres. Silas had planted 60 acres to soybeans that year, but he hadn't planted a hybrid. He had planted a mix of 14 different heirloom soybean varieties with names like Black Jet, Man's Brown, and A Green. Some were bush types, some were tall, some matured early, some late. They were a messy, non-uniform patchwork in the field. When the blight arrived, it hit them too. But it didn't spread. A plant of black jet would wilt and die. 3 feet away, a man's brown plant remained dark green and healthy. The pathogen, specialized to exploit a specific genetic weakness, couldn't find a consistent pathway through the genetic diversity. The loss was scattered, never more than 15% of the stand in any given area. Silas walked his bean rows every evening, notebook in hand. He marked which varieties showed symptoms and which stood clean. He was conducting, in real time, the field trial the seed companies had never run. He wasn't praying for a miracle. He was getting a report from his library. And the report was clear. Diversity was holding the line. The contrast became visible from the road. By early August, Dave Kressler's vast, neat fields were a sepia photograph of death, crisp, brown, and silent. The field next to it, Silas's field, was an uneven tapestry of green, bronze, and brown, buzzing with insects that had fled the dead zones. People started to notice. They'd drive by, slow down, and stare. One afternoon, Jim Coyle himself detoured from a dispiriting visit to Bill Jepson's farm. He pulled his county truck onto the shoulder and got out. He stood for 10 minutes just looking. He saw what Silas saw, isolated damage but no epidemic sweep. His agronomist's brain, trained to seek single solutions, struggled with the data. There was no single solution here. There were dozens of them, each a different plant. He walked up Silas's driveway. Silas was on his porch cleaning seed. Jim Coyle had been the county agent for 12 years. He had sat through those Grange Hall meetings. He had in his heart believed in the narrative of progress through science and uniformity. He had subtly dismissed Silas as a relic. Now he felt like a man who had followed a detailed map right off a cliff. "Silas," he said, "Jim, your beans. What about them? They're not dead. Some are, not most." "Why?" Silas set down the screen he was using to winnow bean seeds. He looked at Jim not with triumph but with the weary patience of someone stating the obvious. "Because they're not all the same. The blight can't get a foothold if it has to keep changing its keys. My grandfather called it the mixed lock field. Too many different tumblers for one thief." Jim leaned against the porch post. "The state lab says this is race 25. None of the commercial resistance works." "I heard. What do you have in there that's working?" Silas gestured to the rows of jars and sacks inside his screen door. "I won't know for sure until harvest, but man's brown looks clean. So does A-green. The black jet is getting hit hard. I won't save seed from that one this year." Jim felt a surreal dislocation. Here was a farmer in the midst of a county-wide agricultural disaster, calmly talking about selecting which seeds to save for next year, as if next year was a certainty. For everyone else, next year was a terrifying question mark. "Silas," Jim said, his voice quiet, "people are going to need seed next spring, seed that can grow in soil that's full of this blight." Silas looked out at his field, then back at Jim. "I know." That conversation was the first pivot. The problem was no longer just a disease. It was a seed crisis. The entire county's supply of viable, blight-tolerant soybean seed for the next planting season was currently growing on 60 acres of Silas Gable's land. And it was a mixed, uncertified heirloom mess. The commercial system had no answer. The seed companies would spend the winter trying to back-cross resistance from old genetic lines into their hybrids, a process that would take 3 to 5 years. Dawes County didn't have 3 to 5 years. It had 7 months until planting time. Jim Coyle drove back to his office and made 2 calls. The first was to his superior at the State Extension Service, explaining the situation. The second was to Dave Kressler. "Dave, I need you to do something for me, and you're not going to like it." "What's left to like, Jim? I need you to go talk to Silas Gable." Dave showed up at Silas's farm that evening. The humiliation was a physical weight on his shoulders. He found Silas in the barn, weighing sacks of seed on an old balance scale. For a minute, neither man spoke. The sounds of the barn, swallows in the rafters, the creak of wood filled the silence. Dave finally said, "Jim Coyle says you've got beans that lived. Some. He says you might have the seed we need for next year." Silas finished weighing a sack, wrote a number in his ledger and looked up. I might. Dave's face contorted, a mixture of anger and despair. We're ruined, Silas, do you understand? Bill Jepson's talking to a bankruptcy lawyer. My operating note is due in November and I've got no crop to sell to pay it. The bank's going to take my land, all of it, over a damn bean blight. Silas nodded slowly. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say he told him so. He said, my grandfather lost half his farm to a corn rust in 1958. Not to the rust itself, but to the debt he took on after. He said the disease only kills the plants. It's the debt that kills the farmer. Dave wiped his face with his hand. So what do? Silas walked over to a large wooden bin. He reached in and scooped up a handful of small, hard, mottled brown seeds. He held them out in his palm. This is man's brown. It's an old forage soybean. The yield isn't what you're used to. Maybe 25 bushels an acre where you got 45 with your hybrids, but it's standing green out there right now. Dave stared at the seeds as if they were artifacts from another world. You'd let us plant your seed. It's not letting. You'd have to buy it. I've got to multiply it. I can't feed the whole county from this one bin. Dave let out a short, bitter laugh. Buy it. With what? Silas, we're broke. We spent every last dollar on the fancy seed and the chemical that didn't work. Silas closed his hand around the seeds. Then we have a different problem. The blight is one thing, the money is another. He saw his grandfather kneeling in the dust. He saw the chest in the barn. He saw the quiet, stubborn work of 40 years culminating in this moment, not of victory, but of an impossible choice. He could save the seeds or he could save his neighbors. He wasn't sure he could do both. The news spread quietly at first, from Dave to Bill, from Jim Coyle to a few other desperate men. By mid-August, a grim pilgrimage began. Pickup trucks would idle at the end of Silas's lane, the drivers working up the courage to turn in. They came with empty seed bags and broken pride. They found a farmer who was not gloating, but who was visibly overwhelmed by the scale of the need. Silas's kitchen table became a crisis center. He had maps of his bean field, charts of which varieties grew where, and a ledger estimating how much seed each area might produce. The numbers were devastatingly small. Even if he harvested every single viable seed from his 60 acres, he might have enough to replant a few hundred acres countywide, not the thousands that were lost. He needed to turn this year's harvest into next year's seed on a massive scale, and he had neither the land nor the time. One afternoon, with 5 desperate farmers sitting around his table, Silas laid it out. This isn't a warehouse, he said, tapping the map. This is a library, and you all need to check out the same book at the same time. I can't give you the book. I can give you a few pages to copy. You have to grow your own copies this fall. The men looked at him, confused. Plant now in August. Winter wheat ground, fallow fields, garden plots, any patch of dirt you've got. We plant nurse crops. Small plots just to grow seed for next spring. It's a gamble. Early frost could wipe it out, but it's the only gamble we've got. It was a radical, almost absurd proposal. Instead of harvesting a cash crop, they would be planting a rescue crop with no guarantee. They would be farming like Silas Gable. The very thing they had mocked him for was now their only lifeline. And the blight spores in the soil were waiting, testing whether this old man's faith was a quirk or a prophecy. They called it the Hail Mary planting. In the 3rd week of August, 1997, 14 farmers in Dawes County broke every rule they'd ever been taught. They disked under failed soybean fields that were still warm with blight. They tilled small patches behind barns in old garden plots, on eroding hillsides they usually left fallow, and they planted Silas Gable seeds. Not with expensive planters calibrated for perfect spacing, but with old grain drills, hand seeders, and in some cases, by walking rows and broadcasting seed by hand. They were planting a crop that wouldn't be harvested for grain, but for its own future. The seed, precious and finite, was measured out in pounds, not bushels. Dave Kressler planted 2 acres. Bill Jepson planted 1.5. Others planted half-acre plots. The total was just under 20 acres scattered across the county. If it failed, they would have sacrificed their last reserves of fuel, labor, and hope. But as Silas told them, standing in a circle in his yard with a sack of man's brown seed open on the tailgate of his truck, farming is always a gamble. You've just been betting on the same number for 30 years. Time to spread the bet. The weather turned against them immediately. The last week of August was brutally hot and dry. The tiny plots planted shallow baked. For the first week, nothing emerged. Doubt was a physical presence. Farmers would drive to their little patches after dinner, kneel and scrabble at the dirt looking for a sign of life. The fear wasn't just of failure. It was of looking like fools twice over, first for trusting the hybrid system, then for trusting the town crank. Dave Kressler's wife, Mary, asked him the question haunting every kitchen. What if this doesn't work? What's left? Dave didn't have an answer. He just stared out the window at the 2 acres of bare dirt that represented his last chance at staying on his land. Then on September 2nd, a slow, soaking rain fell for 18 hours. 5 days later, the first green shoots pushed through. Not the uniform carpet of a hybrid field, but a speckling of green, uneven, tentative, but alive. The relief was visceral but temporary. Now the race was against the calendar. The plants needed to grow, flower, set pods, and mature enough seed before the first killing frost, which could come as early as mid-October. They had maybe 6 weeks. Soybeans typically need 100 days. They were asking for a miracle in 45. Let me tell you about the man who was watching this experiment with more than academic interest. His name was Martin Voss, a regional vice president for the seed company whose hybrids had just failed. He'd gotten reports from Jim Coyle's extension bulletins and from his own field agents. He knew about the blight, the total loss, and the desperate pivot to heirloom seed. And he saw a problem and an opportunity. The problem was liability. If farmers successfully replanted with non-proprietary, publicly available heirloom seeds, it would undermine the entire value proposition of the company's patented genetics. The opportunity was control. If the company could position itself as the savior by somehow acquiring, certifying, and selling the very same resilient genetics, they could turn a disaster into a market lock. Voss arranged a meeting with Jim Coyle. He framed it as a desire to help. Voss was a handsome man in his 50s with the polished demeanor of a man who solved problems in conference rooms, not fields. He sat in Jim's office and offered sympathy. A terrible situation, Jim, truly. We're mobilizing all our breeding resources to get a resistant hybrid for next year. Jim, exhausted and skeptical, nodded. That's good to hear, Martin, but next year is a long way off for men who are bankrupt now. Voss leaned forward. Which is why I'm here. We understand some farmers are trying to replant with alternative varieties, uncertified seed. That's a dangerous path. There's no guarantee of germination, no weed seed analysis, no phytosanitary certification. It could introduce new diseases, new weeds. It could make a bad situation catastrophic. Jim felt a cold prickle on his neck. What are you suggesting? We want to help. Our labs can test this heirloom material. We can run it for disease, purity, germination. We can even bulk it up in our greenhouses this winter, produce clean, certified seed for spring planting. We provide it to the farmers at cost as a gesture of goodwill. It sounded reasonable, charitable even. Jim Coyle, an employee of a public institution, was trained to see corporations as partners in progress. But a warning bell, faint from disuse, rang in his mind. He thought of Silas Gable's hands, carefully winnowing seed on his porch. He thought of the word control. He said, I'll pass the offer along to the growers involved. Jim drove to Silas's farm that afternoon. He repeated Voss's offer verbatim. Silas listened while he repaired a harness strap. When Jim finished, Silas asked one question. If they bulk up the seed in their greenhouses, who owns it? Jim hesitated. I suppose they would. They'd be the producers. And if they patent the resistance traits they find in it? Jim had no answer. Silas set down his tools. They won't sell it at cost, Jim. They'll sell it at a premium with a technology fee and a license agreement that says you can't save the seed from that crop. They won't solve the problem. They'll just own the solution. And my grandfather's beans become their property. Jim argued, but they have the resources to scale this up fast to get enough seed for everyone. At what price? Silas said, his voice quiet but firm. The price is the farm, Jim. Maybe not this year, but eventually. It always is. You trade the problem of blight for the problem of debt, and the debt lasts longer. Jim left feeling torn. Silas's warning felt paranoid, yet history was on his side. The ice storm of '87 hadn't been an act of a corporation. It was an act of God. This was different. This was a system seeing a threat to its logic and moving to absorb it. The tension split the group of 14 farmers. When Jim relayed the seed company's offer at a tense meeting in the Grange Hall, a faction led by Bill Jepson saw it as a lifeline. They've got greenhouses. They can give us pure seed, guaranteed. Silas, you can't possibly clean and test all the seed we need by spring in your barn. Silas didn't shout. He stood at the front of the room with a quart jar of man's brown seeds. This is pure. I cleaned it. I tested the germination in a pie plate on my windowsill. What they call pure is a legal definition that gives them a certificate and a barcode. What you need is a plant that will grow in blighted soil. This will, and it will make more of itself. Their seed won't. Dave Kressler, caught in the middle, asked the practical question. Silas, even if we get a crop off these nurse plots, there won't be enough. You said it yourself. We might get enough seed to plant a quarter of what we need. What then? Silas had been waiting for this question. Then we plant a quarter and we save all that seed, and the next year we plant half, and the year after we're back. We rebuild slowly on our own terms. A groan went through the room. Slow was a luxury they didn't have. Banknotes demanded fast. The seed company's offer was fast. The meeting broke up with no consensus. The fragile alliance was cracking under the weight of systemic pressure. Then the weather escalated. On September 22nd, an early frost warning was issued. Not a killing frost, but a hard chill that could damage flowering soybeans and prevent pod set. The nurse crops were at their most vulnerable stage. Panic set in. That night, the temperature was forecast to drop to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. In a move that seemed pulled from a desperate fairy tale, Silas and the few farmers still firmly on his side, Dave among them, spent the afternoon gathering every piece of floating row cover, old blanket and spare tarpaulin they could find. As the sun set, they were in their small fields, draping the fragile plants against the cold. They looked like ghosts tending miniature shrouded gardens. They lit smudge pots in some fields, the old orchard heaters casting an eerie, flickering light. They took turns through the night, stoking fires, checking temperatures under the covers. It was a fight against the sky itself. At dawn, the frost painted the world white, except for the tiny protected plots where the covers had held, and the plants, touched by the warmth of burning diesel and human desperation, had survived. The effort was primitive, absurd, and heroic. And it worked. The frost killed some unprotected plants on the fringes, but the core of the seed crop was saved. That morning, as the sun melted the frost, Dave Kressler stood with Silas, the acrid smell of smudge pots hanging in the air. He didn't say thank you. He just put a hand on Silas's shoulder, a gesture that said everything. They were in it now, for better or worse. The reprieve was short. 3 days later, Martin Voss made his move. He didn't call Jim Coyle. He sent a certified letter on corporate letterhead to Silas Gable. It was an offer to purchase exclusive rights to all germplasm currently in your possession, specifically including any and all soybean varieties exhibiting tolerance to Phytophthora **, race 25. The offer was for $75,000, with a clause that Silas would cease all distribution of said seeds. It was a buyout, a silencing. For a man living on Social Security and the thin margins of a 300-acre farm, it was a life-changing sum. Voss was betting that an old, stubborn man would finally see reason when presented with a check that could secure his retirement. He was betting that principle had a price. Silas read the letter at his kitchen table. He read it twice. Then he folded it, put it back in the envelope, and placed it on the corner of the table. He made a pot of coffee. He sat for a long time watching the light change in his yard. He thought of his grandfather's chest. He thought of the dust. He thought of the 14 farmers, their fear, their fractured trust. He thought of the word exclusive. It meant only one. He finished his coffee, picked up the envelope, and walked to the wood stove. He opened the cast iron door, fed the letter to the fire, and watched it curl into black ash. He did not call Martin Voss. He did not tell anyone about the offer. The only record of it was the brief, intense flame in his stove and the hardening of his resolve. The corporation had now formally entered the story. It was no longer farmer versus nature or farmer versus neighbor. It was farmer versus system. The pods on the nurse crops began to swell in early October. The plants were stunted, stressed, but they were producing. The farmers watched them with the intensity of new fathers. Every pod was a potential future. Then, the second blow fell. Jim Coyle got a call from the State Department of Agriculture. A complaint had been filed. An anonymous tip suggested that unregulated, potentially contaminated seed was being multiplied and distributed in Dawes County, posing a biosecurity risk. An inspector would be visiting to assess the situation. The complaint was bureaucratic poison, a weapon of paperwork. An inspector could condemn the seed, order it destroyed, or impose quarantines that would make its movement illegal. The timing was perfect, just as the seed crop was nearing maturity. Silas knew and Jim knew that the anonymous tip had a return address in a corporate office park. The system had a second move. If it couldn't buy the solution, it would regulate it out of existence. On a cold, gray morning in mid-October, a state vehicle pulled up to Dave Kressler's 2-acre nurse plot. The inspector, a young man with a clipboard, got out. Dave and Silas were waiting for him. The inspector was polite, professional, and utterly focused on protocol. "I need to see your records of seed origin, phytosanitary certificates, and your cleaning facility approvals." Dave, who had no such things, began to stammer. Silas stepped forward. "The seed origin is my farm. I have no certificates. I cleaned it in my barn with a fan and a set of screens." The inspector made a note. "I'll need to take samples for lab analysis. Pending the results, this seed may not be legally distributable." It was over. The law, wielded by an unseen hand, was about to seize their future in a plastic sample bag. Silas looked at the young inspector, then at the field of stunted, precious plants. He spoke quietly, but his voice carried across the still field. "You test it. You'll find it's clean, cleaner than anything that comes out of a bag coated in industrial fungicide. But that's not what this is about, is it? This is about a piece of paper that says who has the right to sell life." The inspector, uncomfortable, avoided his gaze. "I'm just following the regulations, sir." "I know," Silas said. "So was the banker who took my grandfather's farm." He turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Dave to handle Chinese letter. The battle had entered a new, legalistic phase, and for the first time, Silas Gable looked like a man who could lose not because he was wrong, but because the rules were written for a different game. The harvest of the nurse crops was just days away, and now the entire yield was under a cloud of state scrutiny. The lab results took 9 days. 9 days where the harvested seed sat in bins and sacks in half a dozen barns under a shadow of potential confiscation. The farmers waited, the tension shifting from the weather to the bureaucracy. Jim Coyle called the state lab every afternoon. On the 10th day, the agronomist came on the line, her voice crisp and professional. "The samples from the Kressler plot and the others you submitted, all clean. No prohibited weed seeds, no detectable levels of the targeted pathogens above background. Germination rate is actually quite high for untreated seed." Jim exhaled a breath he felt he'd been holding for a month. "So it's distributable. From a phytosanitary standpoint, yes, it's just seed." That last word hung in the air, just seed. Not a patented product, not a certified variety. Just the ancient, fundamental unit of agriculture. The system had thrown its best regulatory punch, and the punch had landed on nothing. The inspector's report closed the case. The path was clear. The harvest from the 20 scattered nurse acres was meager but monumental. When the farmers gathered at the co-op to weigh and divide it, the total was just over 800 pounds of cleaned, man's brown soybean seed. 800 pounds. In a normal year, Dave Kressler would plant nearly 30,000 pounds on his land. They stared at the small heap of seeds in a single clean bin. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. Silas, who had overseen the cleaning in his barn, laid out the math. This will plant about 20 acres, give or take. Next fall, if those 20 acres yield even a modest crop, you'll have enough seed for 400. The year after, 8,000. It was a geometric progression of hope. They divided the seed by lottery, drawing numbers from a hat. Each man took home a sack holding his future, a future that weighed less than a bag of dog food. Let me tell you about the spring of 1998. Because when those first 20 acres went into the ground, it wasn't just a planting. It was a declaration. The farmers who had sided with Silas, Dave, and 5 others planted their small plots with a care they hadn't shown in decades. They didn't use the chemical seed treatments. They didn't inoculate with the standard rhizobia blend. They followed Silas's instructions, born of observation. Plant a little deeper, leave a little more space. The seeds germinated. The plants emerged, not with the uniform vigor of a hybrid, but with a stubborn, varied green, and the blight was waiting. The race 25 pathogen was still in the soil. It attacked. Some plants wilted, most did not. The field, again, was a mosaic of life and death, but the life predominated. By July, it was undeniable. On one side of a fence, a field that had been replanted with a commercial, resistant hybrid released in a rush by the seed company was succumbing to the blight in familiar, spreading circles. On the other side, Dave Kressler's 20-acre patch of man's brown was an uneven but healthy sea of green. The difference wasn't a product. It was a principle. News, real news, travels. A reporter from the Omaha newspaper drove out after hearing whispers at a state ag conference. She interviewed Jim Coyle, who gave her the data. She stood in Dave's field and then in the failed hybrid field next door. Her article ran on the front of the business section with a 2-photo spread showing the stark contrast. The headline read, "Old Seeds, New Hope. Farmers Find Answer to Blight in Past." That article was reprinted in farm journals across the Midwest. The phone in Jim Coyle's office began to ring. It was farmers from neighboring counties, then neighboring states. They had the same blight. They had the same despair. They wanted to know, where do we get the seed? This was the moment the story exploded beyond Dawes County. Silas Gable's barn, already the epicenter of a local crisis, became the destination of a quiet, determined pilgrimage. Letters arrived with self-addressed stamped envelopes and pleas for a handful of seed. Pickup trucks with license plates from Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri pulled into his yard. They all asked the same question, "Can you spare any?" And Silas, facing a demand that dwarfed even his county's needs, made a decision. He would not sell the seed. He would give it away under one condition. He called it the seed loan. You could have 2 pounds of seed, enough to plant a small plot. The next year you would return 4 pounds, 2 to repay the loan and 2 to be loaned to another farmer. The seed would multiply and the obligation would pass forward. It was a trust system, built on the honor of people who understood what it meant to lose a crop. He packaged the seed in plain brown paper bags with a handwritten note explaining the deal. He sent out hundreds of them. The postage cost him more than the seed ever had. The corporate strategy shifted subtly. Martin Voss's company and its competitors could no longer ignore the narrative. They began to talk about sourcing novel genetics from landrace varieties and partnering with traditional stewards. They sent polite letters to Silas, now addressing him as Mr. Gable, asking for collaboration. They wanted to study his varieties. He refused politely. He had seen the first letter and he knew what study led to: ownership. Instead, he worked with Jim Coyle and a sympathetic plant breeder from the state university to document the varieties. They published an open access report, putting all the agronomic data, disease tolerance, yield, growing requirements into the public domain. If the knowledge was free, it couldn't be monopolized. It was a preemptive strike, using academia against corporate enclosure. Let me tell you about the reconciliation with Bill Jepson, because Bill, who had pushed hardest for the seed company's help, had taken their offer. He planted their new rushed hybrid on his best 50 acres in '98. It failed just as Silas's group's fields had succeeded. Bankruptcy became inevitable. The bank auction was scheduled for October. The day before the auction, Silas drove to Bill's farm. He found Bill sitting on the porch steps, staring at the empty machine shed. Silas didn't sit. He leaned against his truck and said, "I've got a field that needs combining next week. My arthritis is acting up. I can't run the machine all day. I'll pay you by the hour." Bill looked up, his eyes red. "I don't want your pity, Silas. It's not pity, it's work. I need a hired hand. You need cash. The bank can't take cash you haven't earned yet, makes the accounting messy." It was a fiction, a face-saving lifeline. Bill worked for Silas that harvest and the next. The wages let him rent a small house in town. He never got his farm back, but he stayed connected to the land. Years later, he told Jim Coyle, "Silas didn't save my farm. He saved me from hatting the ground I'd lost." By the year 2000, the man's brown soybean and several other heirlooms from Silas's chest were being grown on over 10,000 acres across 5 states, all through the multiplying network of the seed loan. No single entity owned it. Hundreds of farmers did. The Blight, Race 25, became a manageable nuisance rather than an existential threat because the genetic uniformity it exploited had been shattered. The victory was not the eradication of the disease, but the creation of a landscape where the disease could not dominate. Now let me tell you the surprising detail, the one they don't put in the feel-good stories. In 2003, a graduate student at the university, sequencing the genetics of the man's brown soybean, made a discovery. It didn't have a single, strong resistance gene like the ones engineered into hybrids. Instead, it had a complex of over a dozen minor genes, each contributing a tiny bit of tolerance. This is called quantitative resistance. It's harder for a pathogen to overcome because it has to evolve to defeat multiple defenses at once, but it's also impossible to patent in a neat package. The seed companies had been looking for the magic bullet gene. Silas's grandfather, by simply saving seed from plants that didn't die, had been selectively breeding for this complex, durable resilience for generations. The science had finally caught up to the old man's wisdom. The student published her thesis. Silas, when Jim told him, just nodded, knew it was sturdy, didn't need a number to prove it. Silas Gable died in 2009. He left the farm to his daughter, Anna, who had worked by his side for 20 years. He left one specific instruction. The oak chest and the seed library were not to be sold. They were to be held in trust for the community. Today, the Gable farm is a working farm, but also a seed sanctuary. Anna runs a nonprofit that maintains and distributes over 200 heirloom crop varieties. The seed loan system is now digital, a network mapping who has what seed, but the principle is unchanged. You borrow, you multiply, you pay it forward. The original man's brown seed is still in circulation. If you grow it, you are growing a plant whose lineage survived the 1958 rust, the 1997 blight, and the attempted buyouts of the corporate age. You are growing a story. So let's return to the hook to that summer of '98. The blight did wipe out 96% of the soybean crop in Dawes County, and the old farmer did hold the only future left in his hand. But the real payoff wasn't that he saved the county. It's that he gave the county and then a region the tools to save itself. He didn't provide a fish. He protected the last surviving fish and taught everyone how to breed more. In the end, Silas Gable's vindication wasn't a moment of triumph over his neighbors. It was the moment his neighbors finally understood what he had been trying to preserve all along. Not just seeds, but sovereignty. The ability to face the next storm, not with a purchase order, but with a seed saved from the last one. The story of Silas Gable is often told as a feel-good tale of the stubborn old-timer who was right all along. But that misses the point entirely. This isn't a story about being right. It's a story about what a society chooses to value and what it chooses to discard in the name of progress. Silas wasn't preserving seeds out of nostalgia. He was maintaining a library of genetic options, a biological contingency plan for when the mainstream plan, the efficient, uniform, profitable plan, inevitably failed. We live in a world built on Silas Gable's dilemma, just in different forms. We outsource our memory to cloud servers owned by corporations. We rely on complex interconnected systems for food, energy, and information that few of us understand and none of us control. We trade self-reliance for seamless convenience and autonomy for efficiency. The question Silas's life forces us to ask isn't about farming. It's about dependency. How much resilience are we willing to sacrifice for how much short-term gain? And when the next blight comes, whether it's a digital virus, a supply chain collapse, or a climate event, will we be standing in a dead, uniform field, or will we have preserved the scattered, vital seeds of our own independence? The bankers in the original story thought in terms of contracts and clauses. The seed companies thought in terms of patents and market share. Silas Gable thought in terms of generations. He understood that the true contract isn't the one you sign with a bank or a corporation. It's the one you keep with the future. It's the promise to hand down something more than debt, more than dependency, to hand down a choice. His victory wasn't measured in bushels per acre, but in options per crisis. So the next time you hear a story about an obsolete practice, a stubborn tradition, or a person who refuses to upgrade, pause. Ask not what they are clinging to from the past, but what they might be protecting for the future. In a world hurtling toward standardized solutions, the radicals are no longer the ones embracing the new. They are the ones who remember how to save the old, not to live in it, but to survive because of it. Silas Gable's field is still green. The chest is still open. The seed loan is still circulating. The story continues. And the most important harvest is always the one you plant for someone you will never meet. If you found value in this story of resilience, consider subscribing. We document the fragile, essential things that hold our world together, one stubborn choice at a time. Thanks for watching.